Every family thought the Holloway mansion was haunted, but when the wealthy couple hired Miss Lorraine, a black nanny with a quiet, watchful gaze, she seemed strangely unbothered by the whispers of shadows and screams. "Don't go near the attic after midnight," she warned them. They laughed it off, mocking her old superstitions. But when the clock struck 12, the house answered back. Doors slammed shut, walls dripped with blood-like stains, and a child's laughter echoed from rooms that no longer existed. By the time they realized Lorraine wasn't warning them for her own safety, but for theirs, it was already too late. The Holloway estate had always stood like a scar on the hill, a sprawling Victorian mansion with black iron gates and ivy that crawled like veins up its crumbling brick walls. Locals whispered about the house for decades. They said it groaned at night as though something inside it breathed with a life of its own. Travelers passing through town often asked why the place had been abandoned so long, and the townsfolk would exchange glances before muttering a single word: cursed. For years, no one dared live there. Until the Holloways came. Samuel and Clarissa Holloway were not locals. They were a wealthy couple from the city who wanted an escape from crowded skyscrapers and endless traffic. They craved grandeur, a statement home to match their rising social status. The estate, though weathered and filled with dark stories, was cheap compared to its size. To them, superstition was for small minds. A mansion this large, with stained glass windows and 10 bedrooms, was an opportunity they could not refuse. From the moment they arrived, they treated the house like a jewel waiting to be polished. Clarissa oversaw renovations with sharp precision: new drapes, fresh wallpaper, chandeliers to replace the rusted fixtures. Samuel focused on the land, hiring crews to restore the gardens and build a modern driveway. To anyone watching, the Holloways were breathing life back into the long-dead property. But there was one thing they could not fix with money: the atmosphere. No matter how many walls they repainted, the air inside remained heavy, thick, and cold. The floors creaked as if carrying a burden too heavy to name. At night, faint scratching sounds echoed through the walls, followed by soft footsteps in the hallways, though no one was there. The couple laughed it off as quirks of an old house. Their laughter didn't last long. Within weeks, they realized caring for such a massive property was impossible without help. Clarissa wanted someone to manage the children, tidy the house, and be on call at all hours. Agencies sent profiles of candidates, but none pleased her. She wanted someone discreet, someone who would not ask questions, someone who knew her place. That's when Miss Lorraine arrived. Lorraine was a tall, graceful black woman in her early 50s with silver threading through her thick braids. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of both patience and experience. Her references were impeccable, but what caught Samuel's attention most was her calmness. Unlike other applicants who shuddered at the mention of the Holloway mansion, Lorraine showed no fear. She simply nodded and said, "I know houses like this. They speak if you listen." Clarissa smirked at that comment, dismissing it as quaint nonsense. But Samuel was intrigued. Something about Lorraine's steady gaze made him feel they were safer with her around. Lorraine moved into the servants' quarters at the edge of the estate. From the first day, she took charge of the children, 10-year-old Margaret and 7-year-old Daniel, who warmed to her instantly. Lorraine had a gift for making them feel seen. She would sit with them at night, telling quiet stories in the flicker of lamplight, her voice soothing them into dreams. But alongside her care, Lorraine brought warnings. "Don't go near the attic after midnight," she told the children firmly. "Why not?" Margaret asked, curious. "Because that's when the house remembers," Lorraine said simply. The children didn't fully understand, but they obeyed. They trusted her in ways they didn't trust even their parents. When Clarissa overheard Lorraine's warning, she rolled her eyes. "Really, Lorraine, frightening the children with ghost tales? It's bad enough the townspeople are superstitious. We don't need our nanny filling their heads with nonsense." Lorraine only bowed her head slightly. Better they fear a little than stumble into danger unprepared. "Ma'am," the Holloways laughed about it at dinner, mocking what they called her superstitions. But late at night, when Samuel heard faint scratching from the attic above their bedroom, he found himself remembering Lorraine's warning with a shiver. The first real sign came a week later. Margaret woke screaming in the middle of the night. When Lorraine reached her room, she found the child trembling, pointing to the corner. "A boy," she whispered. A boy was there. He was crying. Clarissa stormed in moments later, her silk robe swishing behind her. "Enough," she snapped. "You're encouraging this nonsense, Lorraine. Children dream. That's all." Lorraine said nothing, but she noticed the frost on the window pane, thick as if it were midwinter, even though it was early summer. The following days grew stranger. Doors slammed shut on their own. The chandelier above the dining table swayed violently during meals, though no draft was present. Daniel began talking to an imaginary friend who whispered secrets only he could hear. Lorraine's face grew more and more grave. Finally, she tried again. "Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Holloway," she said one evening after putting the children to bed. "This house, there are things here you do not understand. You must respect the boundaries. Lock the attic. Leave it be." Clarissa burst into laughter, wineglass in hand. "Respect the boundaries? Lorraine, it's wood and nails, not some sacred temple. You've let the villagers' silly ghost stories rot your brain." Samuel chuckled nervously, though unease stirred in his chest. "It's an old house, Lorraine. Settling drafts, that's all. We're not frightened by bumps in the night." Lorraine looked at them, her dark eyes unblinking. "You should be." Her words hung in the air like a chill draft. But the Holloways brushed them aside, and so the warnings went unheeded. By the end of the second week, the atmosphere in the mansion grew unbearable. The children refused to sleep alone. Lights flickered. Objects disappeared and reappeared in strange places. Still, Clarissa laughed it off, mocking Lorraine's theatrics. What none of them yet realized was that the house wasn't merely restless. It was waiting. And every night, as the clock in the hallway ticked closer to midnight, something in the attic stirred a little louder. Lorraine could feel it. She had felt such things before in her life. Places where history refused to stay buried, where grief turned into hunger. She knew the house was alive in its own way, feeding on the arrogance of those who disrespected it. She knew what was coming, but the Holloways would not listen. The stage was set. The house, silent during the day, was ready to reveal its true nature. And when it did, no amount of wealth, pride, or disbelief would protect the Holloways from the truth Lorraine had tried so hard to tell them. The clock was ticking toward midnight, and the mansion was preparing to feast. The first midnight passed with whispers, faint like a breeze moving through hollow wood. The second midnight brought thuds, measured and deliberate, as though footsteps circled the attic. By the third, the Holloways' laughter had grown quieter, their forced dismissals less confident. Still, they refused to acknowledge the truth in Lorraine's warnings. On the fourth midnight, the house shed its patience. It began with Daniel. The boy woke to a voice soft and coaxing, as though calling him to play. When Lorraine found his bed empty, she followed the sound of giggles up the staircase, only to see him standing in the hallway, staring at the attic door. His tiny hands reached for the knob. "Daniel!" she called sharply, and he froze. The boy turned slowly, his eyes wide as if caught between two worlds. "She says I have to come play," he whispered. "She says she's lonely." Lorraine scooped him up and carried him back to bed, whispering prayers under her breath. She had no doubt something in the attic had spoken to him. The next morning, Clarissa dismissed the story with a scoff. "Imaginary friends. All children have them. You indulge him too much, Lorraine." But Samuel, though he said nothing, avoided looking at the ceiling above their bedroom. He had heard the scraping noises too. By the end of that week, the house no longer confined itself to whispers. It demanded attention. One evening during dinner, the chandelier above their table began swaying violently. Dishes rattled, wine spilled across the white tablecloth, and the children screamed. Samuel jumped to his feet, shouting for calm, while Clarissa turned pale, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Lorraine stood silently in the corner, her expression grim. She knew this was no random tremor, no harmless draft. The house was growing stronger, feeding off the fear it provoked. That night, she barred the children's door, placing a bowl of salt by the threshold and murmuring words in an old tongue. She could feel the Holloways watching her with suspicion, but she cared little for their judgment. "Your rituals won't stop a creaky house," Clarissa muttered under her breath. "Then let the house show you it is more than creaks," Lorraine replied softly. The words unsettled Samuel, though he tried not to show it. By the second week, the Holloways' defiance began to crack. Clarissa started avoiding mirrors. Too many times she caught glimpses of movement in their reflection, pale faces that weren't hers, shadows that lingered even after she turned. Once, while brushing her hair, She swore she saw a child's reflection standing just behind her shoulder. When she spun around, the room was empty. Samuel began to dream of water, dark and suffocating, flooding the halls of the mansion. He woke each night drenched in sweat, heart pounding, his ears straining for the faint sound of rushing water that seemed to echo from the walls. The children grew restless, plagued by nightmares. Margaret cried that the boy she saw wasn't just a dream. He had touched her hand, cold as ice. Daniel spoke of a woman with hollow eyes who whispered secrets about the attic. Lorraine did everything she could to shield them, but she could not fight what was coming. The house had chosen its rhythm, and it was accelerating. The turning point came one stormy night. Lightning split the sky, rain hammering against the stained glass windows. Lorraine sat awake, rocking slowly in her chair, listening to the storm. Then, above the thunder, she heard it, the attic door creaking open on its own. She rushed upstairs, but the hallway was already alive. Cold air poured from the attic, chilling her to the bone. The children's laughter echoed faintly, twisted and distorted, though both were asleep in their beds. The air smelled of rot, of something long buried clawing its way free. Samuel appeared moments later, his face ashen. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before Lorraine could answer, a shape moved at the top of the stairs, a flicker of pale limbs, a blur of motion. Samuel stumbled backward, his voice breaking. What was that?" Clarissa appeared behind him, her robe clutched tightly around her, her face drained of color. "Tell me you saw it too," she whispered. For the first time, the Holloways did not laugh. Lorraine stepped forward, her voice firm. "I warned you. The attic remembers. You must leave this house tonight." But Clarissa's pride rose like a shield. "Leave and be mocked by everyone? This is our home. We don't run from shadows. Shadows don't slam doors," Samuel muttered bitterly, his voice trembling. That night, no one slept. From then on, the mansion became a battlefield. Every midnight brought escalation. Doors locked themselves. Objects hurled across rooms. Whispers swelled into screams. The air grew so cold frost formed on the windows, even as fire blazed in the hearth. Clarissa began unraveling. Her face grew gaunt, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. She drank more each evening, clutching her glass like a lifeline. One night she screamed at Lorraine, accusing her of stirring this chaos, of inviting evil into the house. Lorraine did not flinch. "Evil was already here," she said quietly. "I only tried to warn you." Samuel, once dismissive, now clung to Lorraine's every word. He begged her to explain what haunted them. She told him only what he was ready to hear, that the house was not empty. That grief and cruelty had soaked into its walls long before they moved in, that the attic was a mouth and it was opening wider each night. The children grew quieter as though drained. Margaret stopped playing, her drawings turning into disturbing sketches of faceless figures in drowning halls. Daniel wandered the corridors in a daze, whispering to his unseen friend. One morning, Lorraine found him standing in front of the attic door again, his small hand pressed against the wood. "She says it's almost time," he murmured. Lorraine pulled him away, heart pounding. She knew the house was trying to claim him. Children were always the easiest to lure, the most sensitive to the veil between the living and the dead. She doubled her efforts, keeping bowls of salt by the doors, burning protective herbs, whispering prayers into the dark. But the house mocked her, bending her defenses, laughing through the screams in the walls. The Holloways reached a breaking point. One evening, after a particularly violent episode in which every light in the mansion exploded at once, Samuel demanded they leave. "We can't stay here, Clarissa," he said, his voice shaking. "This house is killing us. Killing the children." Clarissa's pride fought to the surface, but even she could not ignore the bruises on her arms from unseen hands that had grabbed her in the dark. Tears streaked her face as she finally whispered, "If we leave, we lose everything. People will think we're insane." "Better insane than dead," Samuel shot back. Lorraine listened in silence, her expression grim. She knew it was too late for a simple escape. The house would not let them go so easily. The mansion was alive now, fully awake, and it had tasted their fear. And as the next midnight approached, the air grew heavier, pressing down on every corner of the estate. Lorraine could feel it, the way one feels the charge of lightning before a storm. The house was ready to reveal itself completely. The Holloways had mocked her, ignored her, dismissed her wisdom. But soon, They would no longer have the luxury of disbelief. For when the clock struck 12, the house would feed, and not all of them would see the morning. The final night began with silence and unnatural, suffocating quiet that pressed against the walls of the Holloway mansion. The storm outside had broken hours earlier, leaving the air damp and heavy, but the house itself felt charged, alive with anticipation. Every creak of the floorboard sounded deliberate. Every gust of wind through the cracks seemed like a whisper. Lorraine sat awake, her hands clasped, listening. She had prayed, burned herbs, placed salt in the doorways. Still, the weight in her chest told her the house would not be denied tonight. In their bedroom, Samuel tossed restlessly, drenched in sweat. Clarissa sat at the vanity, staring into the mirror, her face pale. She had begun to see them, faces, flickers of children not her own, crowding just behind her reflection. Every time she blinked, they leaned closer. Now she could barely look away. At precisely midnight, the clock in the hallway chimed. The sound seemed to ripple through the walls like a heartbeat. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from above. From the attic. Samuel shot upright in bed, his breath ragged. Clarissa's hand clutched the vanity so hard her knuckles turned white. Across the hall, the children stirred, their voices faint but eerily synchronized. "She's here." The attic door groaned open on its own. Lorraine rushed upstairs, her body moving before thought. She found Margaret and Daniel already standing in the hallway, their small hands reaching upward as though drawn by invisible strings. Their eyes were glazed, unblinking. "Stay with me," Lorraine commanded, grabbing their shoulders. "Don't look. Don't listen." But the pull was too strong. Daniel slipped from her grasp, moving toward the attic as though in a trance. "Daniel!" Samuel's voice thundered down the hall as he and Clarissa appeared. But even his command carried no weight against the force drawing the boy forward. The attic yawned open wider, its darkness swallowing the light from the hall. A cold wind poured out, carrying with it the scent of mildew, blood, and something older, something like rot that had seeped into the very bones of the house. And then they saw her. At the top of the attic stairs stood the figure of a woman, pale and translucent, her eyes hollow sockets that dripped shadow. She was dressed in tattered white, her hair stringy and wet as though she had drowned. Her lips moved without sound, but her presence filled the hall with unbearable sorrow. Clarissa gasped, stumbling back. Samuel's jaw clenched as his body shook with terror. Lorraine, however, stood tall, her voice steady. "Back," she commanded, her tone laced with authority. "You cannot have them." The apparition's gaze shifted to Lorraine, and the air thickened. The walls groaned, boards splintering under unseen force. Daniel took another step forward. The shadow woman stretched out her hand, long fingers curling, beckoning. Lorraine's heart pounded. She knew the house's hunger. It was after the children, their innocence, their warmth. But it also fed on arrogance, on the pride of those who thought themselves untouchable. Samuel lunged, scooping Daniel into his arms. But the boy shrieked, his small body thrashing violently as though something inside him resisted. "She says I belong to her," Daniel screamed, though his voice was not entirely his own. It echoed unnaturally, layered with another tone, deeper, older, and inhuman. Clarissa clutched Margaret to her chest, sobbing. For the first time, the elegant mask she wore cracked completely. "What do you want from us?" she cried out. "We've done nothing to you," the house answered with a roar. Every door in the corridor slammed shut at once. Windows shattered inward, spraying glass across the floor. The chandelier in the hall shook violently before tearing free and crashing down in a spray of sparks and twisted metal. The Holloways screamed. Lorraine stood firm, pulling a small pouch from her pocket. She flung its contents, salt, herbs, and ash, across the floor between the family and the attic. "You will not cross," she declared, her voice rising above the storm of sound. For a moment, the apparition recoiled, hissing, the shadows curling back like smoke burned by flame. The children's cries softened, their eyes clearing slightly, but the house was not finished. The walls began to bleed. Thick, dark streaks seeped from the plaster, dripping onto the floorboards. The smell of iron filled the air. From the shadows, more figures emerged, pale, broken children with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. They crawled along the ceiling, scuttled across the walls, their thin fingers clawing toward the Holloways. Clarissa wailed, clutching Margaret tighter. Samuel pressed Daniel against his chest, his face twisted with horror. "What are they?" he shouted. "The forgotten," Lorraine answered grimly. "The ones this house swallowed. They never left. And now it wants yours." The children of the house circled, their eyeless faces locked onto Daniel and Margaret. The shadow woman let out a soundless scream. The force of it shook the corridor, splintering wood, rattling bones. Daniel's body stiffened in Samuel's arms, his mouth opening as though to answer her call. Lorraine knew she had one chance. She dropped to her knees, pressing her palms against the blood-soaked floor. Closing her eyes, she began to chant in a low, steady rhythm, an old prayer, a shield against things that fed on the living. The house shrieked in defiance. The lights flickered violently, then burst, plunging the hall into darkness lit only by lightning through the broken windows. In the chaos, Clarissa's grip faltered. Margaret slipped from her arms, stumbling forward toward the attic. The girl's face was blank, her movements stiff like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "No," Clarissa screamed, lunging after her daughter. But the closer she got, the stronger the force pulling Margaret became. Samuel reached out desperately with his free arm, but it was Lorraine who acted fastest. With a guttural cry, she thrust her hand into the dark pull and yanked Margaret back. Clutching her tightly, the child sobbed into her shoulder, her trance broken. The apparition screamed again, furious, her hollow sockets dripping black. The air crackled, a violent storm inside the house itself. Then from the attic came a sound like rushing water. The walls trembled. The floorboards buckled. From the darkness above, a torrent of black water burst forth, flooding the hallway. It crashed down in a wave, carrying with it fragments of bones, toys, and scraps of clothing from long-dead children. The family shrieked as the water surged toward them. Samuel clutched Daniel. Clarissa clung to Lorraine and Margaret. They braced for impact, but just before the wave consumed them, Lorraine slammed her hand against the floor and shouted the final words of her chant. The water split. It crashed around them, roaring like thunder, but parted where they stood. The apparition writhed at the top of the stairs, her form flickering, her scream piercing the air. The swarm of hollow children disintegrated into mist, their shapes dissolving into the rushing flood. For a moment, the corridor was chaos incarnate, water, wind, screams, and shadows colliding. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The water vanished, leaving only soaked floors and shattered glass. The apparition flickered one last time, her hollow eyes fixed on Lorraine. Then she dissolved into smoke, pulled back into the attic's gaping mouth, which slammed shut with a deafening crack. The silence that followed was absolute. The hallways collapsed, gasping, clinging to their children. Clarissa sobbed uncontrollably, her pride shattered, her body trembling. Samuel held Daniel so tightly the boy whimpered, but he did not let go. Lorraine remained standing, though her chest heaved with exhaustion. Her hands shook, her voice raw. She knew this was not victory, only survival. The house had not been cleansed, it had been appeased, forced back for now. And as she looked at the terrified family drenched and broken in the hallway, she knew the true horror. The Holloways had ignored every warning until it was nearly too late. And the house was not finished with them yet. The Holloway mansion stood in silence once more. But it was not the peaceful silence of a sleeping home. It was the heavy, watchful quiet of something that had not left, only retreated. The soaked floors glistened under the weak moonlight filtering through shattered windows. Furniture was overturned, shards of glass sparkled like sharp stars across the corridor, and the air smelled of salt, blood, and damp earth. Lorraine leaned against the wall, her body trembling. Every muscle ached from the force of her prayer, but she refused to show weakness. Her eyes scanned the hallway, the children sobbing quietly, Samuel clutching Daniel, Clarissa rocking Margaret with vacant eyes. For all their wealth, all their power, they now looked like fragile figures in a painting of ruin. Clarissa's once perfect hair hung in wet strands, her silk nightgown torn and smeared with streaks of blood from the walls. Her trembling hands clutched Margaret as though letting go would mean losing her forever. She rocked back and forth, whispering the same words over and over. "It's over. It's over. It's over," but Lorraine knew better. It was never truly over with a house like this. She crouched before Daniel, whose wide eyes still flickered with the shadow of something not entirely his own. His small voice rasped, She said I was hers." Samuel's jaw clenched, his arms tightening protectively. For the first time, the proud patriarch's voice cracked. "She's gone now, son. She can't touch you anymore. Lorraine said nothing. She would not speak lies into the boy's ears. Instead, she placed her weathered hand on his forehead, whispering a soft prayer. Slowly, Daniel's breathing steadied, though the faraway glaze in his eyes lingered. They remained in the hallway for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too shaken to breathe deeply. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. We're leaving this place. Tomorrow morning, we'll take the children and go. I don't care what it costs. I'll burn this house to the ground if I must. His voice carried conviction, but Lorraine only shook her head. You cannot burn what is not truly of this world. The house will remain long after the flames. Clarissa's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face desperate. Then what do we do? How do we stop it? Lorraine's voice was firm but weary. You don't, you listen. You respect. You leave when you're told and you never return. Samuel's pride faltered under the weight of her words. For the first time in his life, he looked not like a man in control but a child facing consequences he could not buy his way out of. They gathered themselves slowly, moving the children back into the main bedroom where Lorraine lit what candles remained. The flames flickered weakly against the darkness, casting trembling shadows on the walls. Every creak of the house made Clarissa flinch. Every gust of wind drew Samuel's hand protectively to his children. Lorraine sat at the edge of the room, her eyes never leaving the door. She would not sleep. She knew the house might not try again tonight, but it would remember them tomorrow. And it did. The next morning, the dawn came gray and cold, the air heavy with a damp chill that clung to the skin. Outside, the once pristine Holloway estate looked broken, as though the storm had swallowed it whole. Shattered glass lay scattered across the lawn. Shutters dangled from hinges, banging hollowly against the walls. Samuel wasted no time. He ordered trunks to be packed, servants to prepare the carriages, valuables to be gathered. His voice carried urgency now, stripped of its usual arrogance. But not everyone was so swift to leave. Clarissa stood in the nursery, staring at the rocking chair in the corner. It moved gently on its own, creaking though no one sat in it. Her hands shook as she clutched Margaret's dress tighter. She doesn't want us to go, she whispered, her voice trembling. She's still here, watching. Lorraine appeared in the doorway, her eyes sharp. That chair is not for you. Don't look at it. Don't feed it with fear. Clarissa turned, her face pale. Why us? Why our children? Lorraine stepped into the room, her presence commanding. Because you mocked what you didn't understand. Because you thought wealth gave you power over things older than money, stronger than pride. The house doesn't choose, it consumes what it's given. You fed it with arrogance, and it nearly devoured your children. Clarissa broke then, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Margaret clung to her, confused, frightened. For once there was no elegance, no control, only raw human terror. Downstairs, Samuel barked orders louder, as though the noise itself could drown out the fear in his chest. But even he flinched when the house answered back. Soft whispers trailing through the hallways, the faint sound of children's laughter echoing from the attic. Still, he pushed on. By midday, trunks were loaded. The carriages stood waiting. The Holloways fled the house as though chased by invisible claws, their children bundled close, their eyes darting to every shadow. Lorraine was the last to step outside. She paused at the threshold, turning back to the mansion. Its windows stared back like dark, hollow eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw faces pressed against the glass, small, pale children watching, waiting. She whispered under her breath, "Not mine to save. Not anymore." And then she closed the door behind her. Aftermath, the Holloways never returned to that house. They sold the estate at a loss, moving far away to a bustling city where the noise of carriages and factories drowned out silence. But they were never free. Clarissa could not sleep without hearing faint whispers at night. Sometimes when she glanced into mirrors, she saw children that were not hers staring back. Margaret grew quiet and solemn, never again playing with dolls. She said the dolls watched her too closely. Daniel woke often screaming, his small body drenched in sweat, his voice echoing in that strange layered tone as though the shadow woman still spoke through him. Samuel tried to bury himself in business, in deals and papers, but his eyes betrayed him. They were the eyes of a man who had glimpsed something money could not control.